All right, brace yourselves, because what I am about to tell you is going to sound like something from a dystopian thriller, but it is actually happening right now across multiple British cities, and the implications are absolutely terrifying. Reports are emerging that extremist groups, and we need to be very careful and precise about what we are talking about here, have apparently established significant presence and control in 5 major British cities, creating what some are describing as a migrant war, though that framing is deeply problematic and potentially inflammatory. What we are actually seeing is a complex situation involving organized groups, potentially involving recent migrants, but also potentially involving long-established communities, engaged in territorial disputes, intimidation, violence, and creating zones where normal British law effectively does not apply. The framing of this as a migrant war is problematic because it suggests this is primarily about immigration when the reality is more complex. Yes, migration flows may have allowed some extremists to enter the country or may have created conditions where existing extremist groups can recruit and expand. But describing this as migrants waging war on Britain is inaccurate and inflammatory. What we are seeing is extremist groups, some of whom exploit migrant communities for cover and recruitment, engaged in criminal and violent activities. The distinction matters because if we misdiagnose the problem, we cannot effectively solve it. If we blame migration generally, we miss the specific issue of extremism and organized crime. If we pretend it has nothing to do with migration policy, we ignore genuine policy failures that have allowed dangerous individuals into the country. The 5 cities where this is reportedly happening have not all been officially named in reliable reporting, and we need to be cautious about spreading unverified claims. However, various reports mention concerns in cities with large migrant populations, cities with known problems with gang violence, cities where police resources have been stretched thin. The specific dynamics differ by location, with some areas dealing with religious extremism, others with ethnic gang violence, others with organized criminal networks that happen to involve recent migrants. Lumping all of these together as one unified threat is probably inaccurate, but recognizing that multiple cities are facing different versions of extremist violence and territorial control is important. The government's response, or more accurately the lack thereof, is what has turned this from a serious law enforcement challenge into a political crisis. Keir Starmer's administration has apparently been reluctant to acknowledge the full scale of the problem, reluctant to deploy the necessary police and military resources to reassert control, reluctant to speak frankly about the nature of the groups involved for fear of being accused of racism or Islamophobia or xenophobia. This political paralysis in the face of genuine threats to public safety is catastrophic. When extremist groups believe the government lacks the will to confront them, when they see law enforcement holding back for political reasons, they become emboldened. The situation escalates rather than being contained. The police forces in the affected cities are reportedly frustrated and demoralized. They know what is happening. They know which groups are responsible. They know where the problems are concentrated, but they apparently lack the resources, the political backing, and the legal authority to properly address the situation. When police are told to prioritize community relations over law enforcement, when they are discouraged from targeting specific groups, even when those groups are clearly engaged in criminal activity, when they are second-guessed and criticized for every enforcement action, they become ineffective. And ineffective policing creates vacuums that extremist groups gladly fill. The communities living in the affected areas are the real victims here, and their voices are often ignored in the political debate. These are ordinary British residents, many of whom are themselves from migrant backgrounds, who are being intimidated, threatened, and in some cases subjected to violence by extremist groups claiming to represent them or protect them. They want normal law and order. They want to be able to live safely. They want British law to apply equally to everyone. But they are caught between extremist groups on one side and an ineffective government on the other, with nobody effectively protecting them.
The media coverage of this situation has been complicated and in some cases inadequate. Some outlets are being very cautious, perhaps overly cautious, about reporting the ethnic or religious backgrounds of the extremist groups involved, fearing accusations of bias or bigotry. Others are sensationalizing the situation and using inflammatory language that makes constructive discussion difficult. What is needed is accurate, detailed reporting that names the specific groups involved, describes their ideologies and activities precisely, and holds the government accountable for its response without descending into xenophobic scaremongering. The political exploitation of this situation is already happening, with various parties using it to advance their agendas. The Conservatives are attacking Labour for being soft on extremism and unwilling to protect British citizens. Reform UK is using this as evidence that immigration is out of control and that the establishment parties cannot be trusted on security. The far right is using this to promote genuinely racist and xenophobic narratives that blame all migrants and all Muslims for the actions of specific extremist groups. Separating legitimate concerns about extremism and public safety from illegitimate attempts to promote hatred and division is crucial but difficult. The international dimension is also significant. Some of these extremist groups apparently have connections to international networks, receiving funding or ideological direction from abroad. Some may have members who entered Britain specifically to advance extremist agendas rather than as genuine refugees or migrants. This means that domestic law enforcement alone may be insufficient, that intelligence services and international cooperation are necessary to fully address the threat. But that requires the government to acknowledge the international dimensions of the problem, which they seem reluctant to do. The legal framework for dealing with extremist groups is complex and sometimes inadequate. Britain has various terrorism and extremism laws, but they require proving specific elements, and they can be difficult to apply to groups that engage in violence and intimidation, but stop short of acts that clearly meet legal definitions of terrorism. There may be a need for new legislation or new enforcement powers, but any such changes need to be carefully crafted to avoid infringing on civil liberties or abusing directives. The community response has been mixed. Some community leaders are working with authorities to identify and isolate extremists, to prevent recruitment, to promote integration and lawful behavior. Others are defensive, denying problems exist or blaming law enforcement for targeting their communities unfairly. Some communities are deeply divided, with moderates genuinely concerned about extremism existing alongside extremist sympathizers or those too intimidated to speak out. Effective counter-extremism requires community cooperation, but achieving that cooperation when trust is low and grievances are high is extremely difficult. The economic impact of extremism and lawlessness in these cities is significant. Businesses are afraid to operate in affected areas. Property values decline, investment flees, employment opportunities disappear. This creates a downward spiral where economic deprivation makes communities more vulnerable to extremist recruitment, which makes the situation worse, which drives more economic decline. Breaking this cycle requires both effective law enforcement and economic investment, but the government seems incapable of delivering either. The long-term implications if this situation is not properly addressed are genuinely frightening. If extremist groups are allowed to establish permanent territorial control in British cities, if areas exist where British law effectively does not apply, if citizens cannot rely on government protection, then the basic social contract is broken. That leads to vigilantism, to sectarian conflict, to the breakdown of civil society. Other groups will organize for self-defense, communities will become increasingly divided, and violence will escalate. Preventing this requires immediate, decisive, sustained action, but the current government seems incapable of providing it. The role of social media in both spreading extremist ideologies and in organizing extremist activities cannot be ignored. These groups use encrypted messaging, use social platforms for recruitment, use online propaganda to radicalize new members. Effective counter-extremism requires addressing the online as well as the physical dimension, but that requires resources and expertise that law enforcement often lacks. Thanks for watching, and this is a developing situation that we will continue to monitor closely.